Follow the Money is made on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
Well, in essence, the government's response to the so-called Murphy inquiry, chaired by the late Peter Murphy, it's appalling. It's absolutely appalling.
One for mum, one for dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics, and policy in plain English. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. As we record, federal parliamentarians are debating the government's proposed gambling reforms.
We are getting the balance right, letting adults have a punt if they want to, but making sure that our children don't see betting ads everywhere they look. Because we don't want kids growing up thinking that footy and gambling are inextricably linked.
But the government's response falls well short of the recommendations made by the parliamentary inquiry into online gambling harms, led by the late Labor MP Peter Murphy. Experts and members of the crossbench, amongst others, have been highly critical of the bill.
What the Prime Minister's recommended is only a half measure, a timid response. It doesn't solve the problem of protecting kids.
The gambling industry does not spend hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising every year because it has no effect. They do it because it works.
This bill that the government is introducing this week does nothing to stop gambling companies directly targeting addicts.
Andrew Wilkie is the independent federal member for Clark, and he joined Australia Institute Strategy Director Noah Schultz-Byard last week as part of our webinar series. During the conversation, Andrew was scathing about the government's response to the Murphy inquiry. He also reflected on the state of Australian politics and why he wants to make polluters pay for the damage they do to the climate. This conversation was recorded live on Wednesday, the 5th of August, before this week's parliamentary debates about gambling reform commenced. I hope you enjoy it.
Andrew, thank you so much for being with us today and welcome to the conversation.
G'day, Noah. It's always nice to work with the Australia Institute.
That's very kind of you. And I thought I might kick us off today with a question about just the state of play, the state of politics and where we're at. So you've been on the crossbench for more than a decade. You've been there through minority parliaments and majority governments. You've watched trust in politics go up and you've watched it go down. From where you sit, how would you describe the current state of Australian politics right now?
Well, sadly, I'd have to observe that the level of dissatisfaction and distrust in the community of not just the major political parties, I'd expand that to really describe it as the political class, the ruling class. I think that dissatisfaction and distrust is near on a record high. We would need more than this hour to just tease that single point apart. So if I just pick a couple of highlights of why I say that, I think in some quarters there is a sense that the political class is out of touch with everyday people and their everyday challenges, and is not doing enough to address those challenges. But it's also a function of so many other things. You know, there's a concern that whoever's in government are too secret. There's a lack of transparency. There's cronyism. There's a dissatisfaction that whoever's the alternative government is not up to the job, that in fact we don't have an alternative government at this stage. And in fact, if you don't have a credible alternative government, you've basically got an elected dictatorship. It's a bit grim to put it that way. You know, concern in our institutions, the question marks over the National Anti-Corruption Commission have been well remarked upon. And, they've now got their former head has left, I would say, in controversial circumstances. So there's 101 different reasons why people are unhappy with the parties, the old parties and the political class. But in some ways, that whole issue is a subset of a bigger issue. I think there's an unease an unhappiness in the community more broadly. You know, you look back over the last 6 years, the poor old Australian communities had to deal with everything from COVID and lengthy lockdowns in some jurisdictions, the biggest ground war in Europe since World War II, the shocking atrocities committed in Palestine, in particular in Gaza, the current war in Iran, President Trump, you know, the housing crisis, the cost of living crisis, the uncertainty about what artificial intelligence means, not just for us in the next decade or two, but for our children. And I've got 3 teenage stepsons and 2 teenage daughters. You know, I wonder what on earth does their future hold. So I think there is a restlessness in the whole community, which makes them less forgiving of that political class. In some ways, we've become the lightning rod for the community's unhappiness over a whole range of things. But I do want to finish this long-winded answer now on a positive note.
Oh, great. We always love a little bit of positivity
No,
as well, I feel.
I'm
We're going to
gonna
be
be-
real. We like realism, but a bit of positivity can't
No,
hurt
I'm
too.
going to be positive. We are quick to criticise ourselves in Australia. We can be very tough on ourselves. But you know what? We still have one of the world's best and most honest electoral systems. I think our compulsory preferential voting is a real strength. Our parliament actually works pretty well most of the time. And in fact, viewers might be interested to know that probably 3/4 or more of the parliamentary business never even goes to a vote. It's just the routine running of the country. When you go back to when I was first elected in 2010, we didn't have a government for 17 days until Tony Windsor, Rob Oakeshott and Bob Catter decided whether they'd support Julia Gillard and or Tony Abbott. But we didn't have tanks on the street. There wasn't violence. The caretaker provisions worked. The federal public servant continued to administer the country effectively. Some work is being done to improve the situation. For example, the government's doing some worthwhile work on lobbyists at the moment. It is trying to address some of the big issues like housing and cost of living. There's not another country in the world I'd rather be right now. So I'm actually very grateful that the place works as well as it does, despite the politicians.
Despite the politicians. Well, good on you for injecting some of that positivity into the conversation, because it can be easy to default to the negatives. And we have this conversation about the state of politics in these communities where people are joining us from. There is the positivity, but there's also a sense of frustration out there. We can see that frustration expressed in a range of ways, but one of the clearest ways right now is the rising vote for, I think, both independence, but also One Nation, and their numbers increasing in the polls. What do you think it will take for people to feel as though the politics and the policies are working for them again, to address this sense of potential disenfranchisement in the community?
Well, clearly the government needs to work harder at addressing the challenges that everyday people face every day. Now, I think the recent announcements about changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax, and the fact that we're seeing an easing in property prices across the country, that's good. It's been interesting watching members of the government get themselves in knots when asked the question, is it a good thing that property prices are falling? Of course, it's a good thing that property prices are falling. I applaud that. And it's not like they're going to lose all of the gains over the last, or particularly 5 or 6 years. If it falls 10% Sydney or Melbourne, property owners will have still enjoyed a thumping capital growth in recent years, despite a fall at the moment. But hopefully it will make property just a little bit easier to secure by people who want to purchase. And the fact that there are still very generous tax breaks for people building new property, hopefully that will achieve the aim of increasing housing supply. So there's an area of policy that has been very, very difficult historically, and I applaud the government for making some pretty politically tough decisions. And they're going to lose a bit of skin over this, but that's the sort of thing governments are elected to do. But of course, there are so many other challenges governments need to address. I mean, I'm coming to you from Hobart in Tasmania. Our public health system is a shocker, and in fact, it's a shocker in many parts of the country. Our schools are still underfunded. You know, we're still a fundamentally unfair country. We've become a country of haves and have-nots. And I really lament this fact that we're the 14th biggest economy in the world. And we've only got 28 million people. So our per capita wealth is sky high. We shouldn't have people homeless. We shouldn't have a lack of crisis accommodation for people fleeing gender-based violence. We shouldn't have people waiting years to see the specialist and then wait years further for their hip replacement. We shouldn't have underfunded schools. We can be a fairer country. I mean, I think these are the sorts of things that governments have got to focus on, and the alternative government has also got to focus on. And those of us around the margins, including One Nation, in particular One Nation, stop fueling hatred and stop complaining about things and start developing a sophisticated policy offering that's not only a mile wide, but it's got to be more than an inch deep. I think that's the way to rebuild public trust in governance and governments and politicians in this country. To start governing for the people and not governing for vested interests, like the fossil fuel export companies or the gambling companies or the live cattle export industry into Asia, which is still largely untouched, even though we've got a commendable ban coming in on cheap exports to the Middle East.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. You raised the point about our potential standard of living. The Australia Institute, we often point out that we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world at the wealthiest point in human history. And it's a great trick that's been played on us that's made this country feel poor when it's simply not the case. And we can afford to do almost anything we want. The problem is that we can't afford to do everything. And that's kind of where the politics comes in, making those decisions about priorities.
Yeah, but no, we can afford to do everything that needs to be done. It's all about what are our priorities as a country. A fabulously wealthy country, as I said before, our per capita wealth, given that we've got such a small population, is very, very high. You know, by some measures, we are in the top few in the world when it comes to our wealth. The fact that we have such chronic disadvantage in parts of our community, that is a direct result of decisions by governments. And so too, they can be solved by decisions of governments. This if you boil this right down, it's a question of what are our government's priorities. You know, are nuclear submarines a higher priority than getting a roof over everyone's head? Well, I would say they're not. The government would say they are. It's all about priorities. I mean, you know, I think at an election time, it's all about choosing the mob that has the best set of priorities, and that will drive the direction their government goes in.
Yeah. You referred there to keeping a roof above people's head. There's one cohort in the community who would be struggling more than others in that state, and that is people who are addicted to gambling, trying to keep their lives on track, trying to keep their homes, trying to keep their families together. You've done a huge volume of work and advocacy in the gambling space, and the government has proposed a series of reforms in a bill relating to gambling advertising. And the bill's being considered by the Parliament currently. The government's proposed some reforms to advertising, but the current bill falls well short of what a lot of people in the community expect. The Australia Institute's polling shows that around 3/4 of Australians support a complete ban on gambling advertising. What's your view on the government's bill and why the government isn't able to bring itself to match that public sentiment?
Well, in essence, the government's response to the so-called Murphy inquiry, chaired by the late Peter Murphy, it's appalling. It's absolutely appalling. The Murphy inquiry came out with 31 recommendations, the best blueprint for reform this country's ever seen. If the government goes ahead and implements what's on the table currently, only 3 of the committee's 31 recommendations will have been acted on, and even then only in part. and it will not have acted on the 3 flagship recommendations, one of which is a complete ban on gambling advertising, phased in over several years. The other one was a complete ban on all sorts of inducements, not just drugs and whatever, all sorts of inducements, almost all of which are currently legal, and also that there be established an independent national regulator instead of this nonsense where we're relying on a part-time, half-baked regulator in the Northern Territory. That's what the community wants. What we are facing at the moment will be something that could well have been written in Sportsbet's boardroom. The government's still going to allow 3 ads an hour from 6 in the morning to 8:30 at night. There's no regulator. There's no ban on inducements. The government is doing just enough to look like they're doing something, and not anywhere near what we need to rein in the predators in the gambling industry. I hold out hope. I mean, some people who have joined us right now might have heard Simon Kennedy on Radio National this morning being interviewed, and he gave me some hope that the opposition is starting to get it, starting to understand the issue, starting to understand the political opportunity of taking a stand and demanding in the Senate that the government's reforms be amended and made at least a bit more effective.
Yeah, agreed. And my colleague Hannah has just put into the chat for anyone interested the Australia Institute's petition to ban online gambling ads. We're at 11,050 signatures on that petition right now, and I'll be checking that number at the end of this webinar just to make sure everybody listening has jumped on and signed that one, because it's important work. The Senate's looking at the bill right now, and the Senate's inquiring into the bill. There was some shocking evidence out of that inquiry this week. You alluded to it, the inducements that these predatory companies offer to people.
You were losing so much money that the betting company could fly you to Melbourne, put you up at the casino, give you tickets to race day, provide you with drugs of your choice, and you're saying that this wasn't just a VIP manager trying to make more money or commission for themselves. The actual leaders of these companies knew, in some instances, what was happening and how the whole thing worked.
Well, not only did they know, they were participating in it.
When you were losing so much money, were you ever asked to verify sort of where the money was coming from? You're a 23-year-old, 24-year-old, and you're losing hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Never once was I ever required to verify my income, verify where the money was coming from, or how I was funding my gambling addiction.
Were you shocked by any of that, or have you been involved in taking on these guys for so long that it's really par for the course?
I know, I wasn't shocked at all.
Yeah.
I was pleased actually that some of this stuff is getting out in the public domain. I first started focusing on gambling reform, before I got into federal parliament. So, and the first time I spoke up publicly, I became a lightning rod for people to come and tell me their stories. I don't know how many people I've spoken to now, including family members of people who have suicided on account of gambling addiction. And the stories I've heard. What we're hearing in the Senate committee is just the tip of the iceberg. I've spoken to quite a few people who have or are regarded as VIPs by the gambling companies, and the largesse that is extended to them is eye-watering. I'm thinking about poker machines here for a moment. I recall one club in Sydney, I think it was. It even had a special door for VIPs. They had their own door with VIP entrance over it. Through to tickets to major events, being given credit to gamble with, illegally being served alcohol while they're gambling. The online gambling space is particularly problematic now because that's the future. Everyone's got for all you know, I've been laying a bet on my phone while we've been chatting. I haven't, by the way, but I might have
I'd
been.
be surprised if you had, but it would be impressive, multi-functioning.
As my old friend Nick Xenophon once said, you could now lose your home without leaving it.
Yeah, true.
And it's so easy to have inducements with online gambling. They give you free, they give you credits and different things, and their algorithm is very well crafted to identify people who they can really exploit, capitalize on, and they really focus on the big gamblers. They look for them in their database, their data sets. They look for them, they find them, and they cultivate them. And then they turn a complete blind eye to the fact that people on modest incomes are gambling ridiculous amounts of money that is either being added to their mortgage or being stolen. Remember that research out of Victoria some years ago found that gambling addiction is the second most prevalent cause of crime in that state after drug addiction.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, there's a human cost here for the poor souls who develop an addiction, and by definition, they can't control their gambling anymore. They are unwell people that we should be wrapping our arms around and helping, right through to, say, the victims of crime. And it's interesting. I've moved a couple of times in the federal parliament a private member's bill that would put an obligation on gambling companies to satisfy themselves that money being gambled isn't the proceeds of crime. And if they suspect it is, they have to report it to the authorities. And if they don't report it and it's subsequently discovered, a court can require the gambling company to repay that money to the original source of the money, the victim of the crime, of the theft. No support from either major party. No support at all.
Yeah.
It tells you what's in the DNA of the major parties when it comes to the power of gambling companies.
Well,
and the media companies, by the way, and the sporting codes.
Yes, true.
How many millions of dollars do the technical media and the print media get from gambling advertising? And how many millions of dollars do the major sporting codes get in sponsorship and also micropayments from the gambling companies when people gamble on their games?
Yes, yeah. I mean, as Robin has said in the chat, what you've described in the gambling industry, Andrew, is state capture. And I did want to ask about other things, but just quickly to round off on the gambling reforms, do you think that there's a chance for improvement here? Is the Parliament going to muscle up and demand something better? Do you have hope that we might be at a turning point?
Well, I think it'll be important for the government to get some reform through, and I think it's like, no, I'm going to jinx myself by saying likely. I think there's a chance the opposition and the Greens, well, the Greens will demand reform, better reform. There's a chance the opposition will see the public interest in better reform and the political opportunity for them to differentiate themselves and to show that they, polish up their credentials, so to speak. So I hold out hope that there will be amendments. What worries me, though, is it might be politically convenient for the government to be able to say the opposition and the Greens blocked gambling reform.
Yes.
Is the government that ruthless politically? Yes. Would it suit their purposes on one level? Yes, because let's face it, the government's so cozy with the media, sporting codes, and the gambling companies. Let's not forget, over the last 5 years, the government and the opposition have both received around $5 million in donations from gambling companies.
Yes, indeed. I wanted to move to a couple of questions around climate policy in Australia. Andrew, earlier this year in the Parliament, you tabled a different Australia Institute petition. This was a petition calling for a climate disaster levy on fossil fuel exports. That was signed by more than 35,000 Australians, some of whom are probably on the call with us today. Thank you for your support. We're entering an era of increasingly devastating climate disasters. Why do you support the idea of a levy specifically? And do you think that we need to think more about who pays for the damage that's unfortunately coming down the line?
Yeah, well, that petition I tabled, from memory, that had about 35,000.
Yes, that's right, just over. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a very popular petition, and that demonstrates the breadth of concern in the community about climate change, dealing with climate change, and working out how to handle the cost of climate change and adaptation. It was a big petition. And I remember in fact, from the Australia Institute's own work at the time, I think you came up with a figure, an annual figure of climate-related disasters. It was in the high 30s. I think it was close to $40 billion a year. That's not
Yeah.
40 million, that's 40 billion, that's $40,000 million a year.
Yeah.
The estimated cost to our country when it's all grossed up of climate-related disasters, whether that be obviously cyclones, bushfires, droughts,
You can see what Europe's going through currently in North America.
Yes, indeed. So I think most people would see it as reasonable that the fossil fuel exporters pay some sort of levy that then loops back and is used to pay the bill. I mean, we want to actually see our fossil fuel exports reduced and eventually stopped. But while we are doing it, let's make the polluters pay. That would be entirely reasonable. And in fact, I'm going to jump across to a significant point. I think many people are unaware of this. The International Court of Justice last year, 2025, ruled that states have a binding international obligation to assess and limit emissions to avert significant climate harm, including what's called Scope 3 emissions, which is the captive emissions. Again, people are probably aware of this. We as a country produce, whatever the percentage is of emissions, a certain percent of the global. However, we don't count in our emissions all of the captive emissions in particularly the coal and the gas we export.
Yes.
So we are a significant global contributor to emissions through our Scope 3 emissions. The ICJ has ruled we've got to take that into consideration. We can't just say that's another country's problem. And the government currently says, well, those emissions should be recorded in the destination country's emissions. Sure, they should account for it as well, but I think we're the source of it. We should account for it. So those exporters, they should be taking responsibility for those emissions and paying a levy. Because ultimately, you send some gas to Japan, it's burned, or some coal to wherever it's burned, it affects the global climate. And and that impacts us directly.
Absolutely. You've segued very nicely into my next question, which was going to be about a gas export tax. This is a proposal that's was originally put forward by the ACTU and then the Australia Institute, and has done some research on this. And really, it's picked up ahead of steam. The support that the idea for a gas export tax has garnered this year has been really quite extraordinary. It's just the idea of a 25% tax on gas that's exported from the country. It's a narrow tax on one segment of the fossil fuel sector. But Australia Institute research shows that it could raise $17 billion a year. It's a popular policy. It could be implemented. You've backed calls for a tougher gas export tax. So I guess my question to you, Andrew, is what would you spend $17 billion on if you just happened to come across that paycheck one day?
Well, yes, I do. I do support a greater tax, a more effective tax regime on our exported gas. And my understanding is there's very broad public support for that. I mean, the call for a tax rests on the fundamental point that it's our gas. If these companies are going to be allowed to extract it and to export it, if they're going to sell our property, they should pay a fair rate of tax. I mean, I can't see why that's in any way debatable. I mean, I will though make the point that this is a very difficult issue for the government politically at this exact point in time, when you've got the Prime Minister tramping around Asia with his hand out for liquid fuels, during what is the biggest energy crunch since the 1970s because of the war in Iran. It is difficult for the Prime Minister to be going to these countries and getting guaranteed supply at this point in time of jet fuel, petroleum, diesel, when these countries are worrying about is the gas we're selling them going to get dearer. I am acknowledging it is a difficult issue politically for the government at this exact point in time, but we can't use the issues at this exact point of time as a reason to keep kicking the can down the road. I mean, you say $17 billion. We should have done this. We should have done this years ago, years and years ago. So I'm not going to suggest how I'll spend $17 billion. I'll suggest how we might spend a darn sight more of it, more than that. By meeting the basic needs of every Australian. We've talked about housing, we've talked about health, we've talked about education. I mentioned crisis accommodation for people fleeing gender-based violence, but we've got crumbling infrastructure. We have completely inadequate income support payments, especially for people who are unemployed and looking for work. But even people on the disability pension, the age pension, if you're paying market rent, you can't live on those income support payments. You can't pay $400 a week in a capital city for a modest apartment and live on the age pension. You just can't. You have to go without food. You have to go without medicine. You have to not turn the heating on. We could spend another hour talking about this point, about how to make the country a fairer country. Yeah.
Do you think one of the challenges that's being faced now is the cost of living and people's concerns about the increasing cost of everything is so all-consuming, in people's busy day-to-day lives, the fact that cost of living is increasing is consuming so much of the oxygen of the conversation? Is there a way that we can bridge this gap and help people with their cost of living while also tackling the climate crisis and other crucial issues? How do we balance the concerns people have?
Oh, I don't think they're mutually exclusive at all. In fact, we can tackle the climate crisis and reduce the cost of living at the same time. I mean, it's very much remarked upon about how the cost of electricity can be so much cheaper if we effectively electrify the country and, based on renewables. We're not going to make the cost of living cheaper by continuing to rely heavily on coal-fired power stations and gas-fired power stations. How do we reduce the cost of living without just handing out money and creating greater inflation? There are ways. Rather than give someone an extra $20 tax break, how about we make bulk billing more effective? See the GP. I'm told now. For the sake of complete transparency, my wife is a GP, so this isn't a lunge for more money for my wife. But I am told by the College of General Practitioners, excuse me, let's go down a rabbit hole here, that the real value of the Medicare rebate for seeing a GP is now about half what it was when it was introduced, I think in the 1980s. It's real value, i.e. GPs are getting, or actually the patient is getting really half of what they used to get in the 1980s to see a GP. So no wonder now it's hard to find bulk billing GPs. But if we fix that part of the public health system, primary health care, that would take some of that financial pressure off people. There's an example. So there was two examples there, actually. Reduce the cost of electricity by fast-tracking electrification and the rollout of renewables. Brings down your energy bill. Improving the rebate for GPs, so you more reliably will get bulk billed when you see a GP. The government's done some good stuff in this space too, with the cost of medications and so on. There's 1,001 ways to more incentives to get people into electric cars. Well, they'll be paying less for diesel or petrol.
And that's where we'll leave the conversation between Andrew Wilkie and Noah Schultz-Byard. The latest Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press is available now. In More Fool Me, How the Gas Industry Tricked Australia, Richard Dennis examines how big gas pulled off perhaps the greatest con in Australia's history. And he outlines the simple steps we can take to fix this mess right now. You can get yours for $19.95 or subscribe to the Vantage Point series for just $64.95 to get 4 engaging essays every year. For a limited time only, pod listeners can use the code FOOLME, that's FOOLME, to receive a free copy of Richard's book Econobabble, along with your Vantage Point subscription. Get yours now at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes. This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 5th of August, and some things may have changed since recording. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm your host, Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.